we ready?
We're ready.
People of Armageddon.
Soldiers of the Imperial Guard. For decades, we have defended this world. Some of you were born here and know only war. Some of you have grown old upon these battlefields. Some of you were brought from off-world, shipped here to die.
I thank every one of you. But look at what's become of our world.
Graveyards that reach from horizon to horizon. Cities cloaked in ash and dust. All
Industry in ruin. The next wave of greenskins will soon reach our world.
They come in numbers the likes of which we've never seen. We're expected to die in duty. To hold the line.
We cannot.
There is no victory to be had here. I cannot ask you to die
In the mud of a world that was lost long ago. Flee. All of you.
Flee. Make for the evacuation transports.
Get off world if you are able. Run for your life. There will be no evacuation.
There will be no cowardice. There will be no defeat. This is our city. This is our world. Soldiers of Armageddon!
Make ready.
Games Workshop, Warhammer 40,000, Armageddon, The Return of Yarrick. Armageddon is a world accursed. Once the planet burned bright in the firmament of the Imperium. Now it is buried beneath the ash of eons. The Ork has savaged this world, maimed it, marked it as his own. Shaped by the claw of the Xenos invader, choked and torn by the industry of war. It has become a monstrous wounded beast that hungers for one thing and one thing alone. War. Blood stains the jutting ribs of the beast's emaciated corpse. Its roar of outrage strips the senses and shivers the mind. Its omnipresent stench chokes and kills as surely as the mindless wrath of the Orks that infest it. Wounded and inflamed though the world may be, the pounding of its heart thuds and thunders as vital as ever. It beats like a great drum of war in the boom of artillery and the rumble of armored columns. It shakes the ground with seismic fury, shattering the dreams of the teeming hives upon its back, summoning ever more warriors from the void. With enough blood and sacrifice, the slaughter ebbs, the beast seemingly appeased. Those hollow-eyed citizens and soldiers caught in its teeth dare to hope, looking to the horizon for a sliver of light. But their hope is false. Each reprieve is only long enough for the most desperate of musters, and the cycle of butchery to begin anew. Each zephyr of clean air is a prelude to the furnace-hot carrion stench of the war beast's breath. For this beast's true master is the warlord Gazgul, and he knows well what carnage it can breed. From the monstrosity that is Armageddon, there can be no escape. Fall of a legend. Amidst the death throes of a world, the old man met the beast of Armageddon in battle. The beast had raised a mountain of insane machinery, an apocalyptic engine, vomiting green lightnings that split the heavens of Icaria like the smile of a leering god. Yet the engine ran amok. Warring armies scattered as the planet's crust was split, shattered by coruscating energy. The convulsions of the dying world left the beast stranded on a rocky mesa, the tatters of his own mighty horde about him. The old man looked upon his nemesis and struck. A mere handful of battleships remained beneath his banner, each bearing veterans of long pursuit to one final assault. A single Fenrisian vessel prowled alongside them, sleek and cruel. Their course took them into the heart of an immense orc fleet. It was a composite thing of iron hatred and raw power, the power to burn worlds. Yet not one shipmaster hesitated, nor did one soldier waver. Bound by the old man's unyielding will, they plunged like a spear down the monster's throat. Through writhing skies and arcs of green lightning plunged the craft of the old man's execution strike, down to the rocky island where the beast raged. How many brave soldiers martyred themselves to clear a path through the orcs charging to meet them? How many war engines were blasted apart to bring the old warrior and his chosen few close? With conjurations of stormfrost, they bound the beast. With flame, bolt, and beam, they scoured his hulking form. In that fated hour, ferocity enough to slay an army was unleashed upon the beast. Then, clearing smoke, and the roar of the wounded tyrant, Fenrisian ice cracked, gunshot loud. The beast of Armageddon charged. The old warrior's bale eye blazed. He moved swiftly, his stolen claw arm swinging with all the conviction that had driven him for so many years. He struck true, his talons lodged deep in the beast's chest. Then, inevitable as the death of Icarus itself, the beast's immense pincer viced about the old man with a crack of bone. The old foes locked eyes before the beast slammed his adamantine skull forward, a battering ram against a splintering door. The blow painted the orc's features crimson black. The beast hurled his nemesis into the dust with an ear-splitting roar. He raised an iron-shod foot, about to bring his weight crashing down on the old man, then stopped, laughing cruelly instead. The shadow of an orc gun vessel spread like a funeral shroud over the battlefield. Still bellowing in triumph, the beast departed. The survivors of the old man's force fled in disarray. Amidst the mayhem, they did not see the old warrior's ruined body borne away by a black-armored priest. Had they realized a spark of life still remained, the old man's followers might still have held out hope. But the roar of the brute still rang loud in their ears. They could only flee, broken as the body of their master, to spread word of his death. Yarrick returns. Commissar Sebastian Yarrick stared out of Icetroll's viewport at the approaching orb of Armageddon. Its oceans were split by ochre continents blanketed with smoke and flame. Armageddon, Yarrick thought, gritting his teeth as fragmented memories of past conflicts flashed through his mind's eye. I shall never leave this place behind me. Yarrick could almost feel the heat searing his skin, hear the roaring of orcs and the screams of the dying. The void around Armageddon seethed with orc battleships. Their lumpen ugly forms drifted over the planet's scorched continents like bloated flies sucking at a festering carcass. Hide-draped servitors clicked and whirred at their stations, cogitating firing solutions and shunting power to void shields at the barked command of the ship's Fenrisian captain. An orc cruiser loomed ahead, seeking to block Icetroll's route into low orbit. Flashes of light erupted from its flanks, barrages of cannon fire streaking past the Space Wolf's vessel. "Forward batteries engage at will! Let them feel the All-Father's wrath!" rumbled a grizzled Space Wolf's bridge officer. Fighter craft danced beyond the armor-glass viewports, exchanging bursts of fire. Yarrick braced as the deck shook beneath him. Ice Troll rocked at the impact of orc fire against its void shields. The sounds of battle triggered something within him, the pain of hurts mercifully half forgotten, the need for vengeance. Exoskeleton servo monitors hissed as he adjusted his balance. Aged joints and old wounds ached, gifts from more than a century of service. Nor had his mind escaped unscathed. There was much he could no longer recall, particularly of recent events. Since his confrontation with the beast of Armageddon, his reconstructed skull had ached as if it was aflame. For long months, he had seen a stranger in his reflection. All was not right. His skin had taken on a waxy pallor that even age could not explain. The Fenrisian warriors he had fought beside had brought him back from the abyss. That much he knew. When asked why, the skull-helmed priest had told him he was more important to the fate of Armageddon than he realized. Yarrick knew the value of symbols well, and had not pressed the matter. Yet they had hardly spoken to him since, as if they could sense the same dreadful wrongness he felt. "I almost died, so they tell me, at the hands of the beast. If they speak the truth, then perhaps it is the Emperor's will that I be denied such a mercy. How else but by his hand could it be that I am drawn to this forsaken place once more, to face Gazgul yet again? He let me live, just to fight me again." Ice Troll's forward lance batteries blazed. The armor-glass viewport darkened to shield the bridge crew from their violent fury. The blinding beams bored into the flank of the orc vessel, gouging holes in its rusty metal hull. It listed towards the planet, caught in Armageddon's gravitational embrace as its engines flickered and died. Gun salvos followed, sealing the cruiser's fate. It broke apart, crumbling and expelling gases, detritus and orcoid crew into the freezing vacuum. Armageddon loomed closer. The bridge officer turned to regard Yarrick through narrowed eyes. "Entering low orbit," the Space Marine snarled. "Get to your dropcraft, Commissar. Bjartar is waiting for you below. He cannot linger here for long." "He smells the curse of Armageddon upon me," Yarrick thought grimly. "They know I cannot escape. Perhaps they are right to be wary. Perhaps I am an ill omen." Turning on his heel, the Commissar strode from the bridge and descended into the belly of the frigate, purging the troubling thoughts from his mind. Now was not the time to dwell on such matters. The fate of Armageddon was at stake. Now was the time for war. Armageddon mustered. Armageddon's skies hung heavy with thick clouds of smoke and pollutants. The last embers of a season of fire fluttered on searing winds as the pall of a season of shadow descended to smother them. Already the continents of war-scarred world echoed with battle. Humans and orcs stirring from their enforced hibernations to resume their bitter conflict. In the long months of the season of fire, Armageddon's defenders had been replenished by reinforcements from distant war zones. Clad in uniforms bearing the heraldry of a dozen different regimentos, these new arrivals were dispersed across the planet. Several Order of our Martyred Lady Preceptories, led by Canoness Preceptor Mercia, and the redoubtable throne-born Dogmata Superior Intransia Frey, landed at Hive Volcanus' spaceport. They were joined by Inquisitor Inigo Croyle of the Ordo Xenos, whose peculiar and menacing Xenos steed drew many a wary stare. The recently appointed planetary governor, Agmund von Ruger, convened the Council of Armageddon. With Croyle, Mercia, and Dogmata Superior at his side, von Ruger declared that the time had come to begin a new offensive. Since the season of blood, the Cornate invasion of Armageddon, and a subsequent season of fire, the Orks' coherence had eroded. Strike hard and decisively, and the Xenos' taint could finally be scoured from the Hive world. Many members of the Council, particularly those with military experience, were unconvinced. They feared any offensive would be premature and that, even reinforced, Armageddon's armies might not guarantee victory. No voice of dissent was louder than that of General Tybalt Locke, Supreme Commander of Armageddon's military forces. It was then that the doors of the council chamber swung open, and the stern figure of Commissar Graves entered, flanked by Officio Prefectus enforcers. Having arrived on Armageddon towards the end of the Season of Blood, Graves had established a fearsome reputation amongst Armageddon's senior officers. Some whispered that her bolt pistol had accounted for more of the world's military leaders than any heretic. Upon the Commissar's dramatic entry, all, even von Ruger, paused as she erupted into furious invective. Graves roared that the Xenos had been tolerated for too long. Talk of caution or compromise was akin to cowardice and would be treated as such. With these words, the discussion came to a swift and decisive end. Even General Locke knew the folly of standing firm against senior representatives of the Inquisition and the Officio Prefectus. A new offensive would have to be planned post-haste. Planning the offensive. Responsibility for the overarching strategy fell to General Locke. Locke, the most senior officer of the Steel Legion, had once served under General Nikita Kurov, a veteran of the Ork Wars. Thrust into overall command of the Astra Militarum forces on Armageddon, and with Graves' burning gaze upon him, Locke set about marshalling the resources at his command. Though the Ork numbers appeared to have been thinned in recent seasons, two particular strongholds remained. Hive Tempestora, ruled by war boss Agrok Glitztooth, and the expanses of the Equatorial Jungle, which concealed many Ork tribes. Of the two, the Equatorial Jungle presented a more promising target. Though it was a truly colossal region and doubtless heavily infested, the Ork tribes that dwelt in its depths were fractious and isolated. With adequate planning and resolve, they could be divided and purged piecemeal. The Purgation Corps. General Locke would divide his forces into army-sized elements known as Purgation Corps. These mechanized forces would contain light armor and transports capable of traversing the jungle and equipped for incendiary and chemical warfare. Rather than pursue the Orks into the tangled forests, they would scour the jungle quadrant by quadrant, burning the foliage until all that remained was a blackened wasteland. Croyle opted to journey south and oversee the Purgation Corps campaign, relishing the opportunity to hunt alien prey. The offensive met with initial success. From the direction of Hive Infernus, Purgation Corps 10 and 11 cleared huge tracts of vegetation around the remnants of Cerberus base, enabling the fortifications to be shored up and reoccupied. In the wetlands of the Purungai Basin, Martian Taraxi and Archaeopter squadrons conducted phosphor bombardments from above, driving frenzied Orks out of their lairs and into the mass fire of Krieg and Cadian infantry. Inquisitor Croyle, too, lent his talents to the war effort by eliminating Ork war leaders. Despite heavy losses amongst the Purgation Corps, the Orks were slowly but surely pressed back. Armageddon's commanders allowed themselves to believe victory might be possible. The Horde returns. Armageddon's descent into planet-wide war came swiftly and without warning. Flashes of emerald light illuminated the storm-racked skies. Fingers of lightning lanced down to scorch the poisoned earth. Combatants Ork and Imperial stopped, gazing up at the conflagration. Meanwhile, the crews of orbiting naval vessels and defense stations yelled in shock and terror as glowing rifts in reality opened around them, vomiting forth lumpen Ork vessels in their thousands. At the heart of the fleet was a monstrous ship, hull wreathed in crackling energies. The Ork fleet opened fire at point-blank range, tearing Imperial craft apart before their weapons could even be primed, and from yawning hangar bays spilt a fiery rain of dropships and fighter craft that plummeted towards Armageddon's surface. Caught utterly flat-footed by the onslaught, General Locke's forces were stretched thin across a dozen fronts. Now hordes of Orks were landing across the plains of Anthrand, raining down in their millions and cutting off the retreat route. Rallying what forces he could, the general dispatched them south of the Vulcanus Mountains, hoping they might blunt the Ork advance. Canoness Preceptor Mercia and Dogmata Superior Frey pledged a portion of their forces to the relief. The Adeptus Sororitas were accompanied to battle by a mass of militant pilgrims, scratch militias, and desperate penitents rallied to their cause. Meanwhile, amid the Ork fleet, the Space Wolf strike cruiser Aistral found itself the focus of ire. Empiric disturbances prevented the vessel's crew from hailing the Hive world until it was too late. Attempts by the strike force's rune priest to summon aid from the great companies had met only with frustration, his psychic sendings blunted by a wall of howling madness. With some difficulty, Commissar Yarrick convinced his Fenrisian guards of the need to reach Hive Vulcanus. He bore a device that might, with the Emperor's blessing, prove capable of piercing the interference and drawing the attention of Imperial forces many light years distant. Grudgingly, the Space Wolves agreed to spare a transport to bear the Commissar towards his destination. They, however, would concentrate their efforts on the Deadlands, securing crucial supplies of water and promethium that would be required if the war efforts were to be maintained. The Speed War. Falling from the bellies of lumpen Ork vessels in their countless thousands, ramshackle dropships plummeted through Armageddon's atmosphere. The blazing fire trails of their atmospheric entry pierced the Hive world's soot-black clouds. Aboard one such craft, Wazdaka Gutsmech thumbed frustratedly at Big Reva's throttle. He couldn't let any other git reach Armageddon before him. His warbike's engine roared and rattled like a caged beast. He felt the dropship lurch again, decelerating as it approached solid ground. Wazdaka adjusted his goggles. Somewhere behind him, his grot oiler, Fix-It, stopped tinkering and reached for a handhold. The ramp began to lower, revealing the mountains of Armageddon, their jagged peaks rising like broken teeth from a sea of ash. Armageddon's searing air howled into the belly of the dropcraft, tearing at Wazdaka's clothes. He gazed down at the rising ground and threw the throttle forward. Big Reva lurched, scattering Orks and Gretchen aside, some unfortunates tumbling out of the opening, screaming as they were swept away by howling winds. Wazdaka felt himself being pressed back into the saddle by the sheer force of his acceleration. He thumbed the switch, heard the roar of afterburners, and felt the heat of flames at his back. Big Reva trailed tongues of flame in its wake as it shot out of the dropship like a bullet and burned a trail across Armageddon's skies. As the warbike's nose began to drop towards the ashen plains below, as the ground rushed up to meet him, Wazdaka gritted his teeth, raised a meaty fist, and slammed it down on a red button mounted on his handlebars. A flash of light erupted from Big Reva's shock booster. Wazdaka let out a gleeful bellow as flames burst from his warbike's exhaust and forks of green-white lightning danced across its frame. Then he was gone, hurled through the warp towards the Hive world's surface, and the cloud of roaring engines, burning promethium and glorious high-speed violence that awaited. The Speed War descends. Caught utterly unprepared by the arrival of the Ork fleet, the defenders of Armageddon were given almost no time to respond. By the time orbital weapons and anti-air batteries flared to life, the first wave of invaders were already slamming down upon Armageddon Prime and Armageddon Secundus. The vanguard of the Ork assault consisted almost entirely of mechanized forces, speed freaks mounted on bikes, ramshackle wagons, and the slavering squigs of beast-snugger tribes. Disparate warbands of these Orks leapt upon isolated defenders and supply convoys, swiftly aggregating into larger cults of speed as the violence escalated. Inter-Hive roadways became drag strips for whooping bands of Ork invaders, who thundered along them, engaging armored columns attempting to supply reinforcements or withdraw battered units. Wazdaka Gutsmech was amongst the first to touch down on Armageddon's rocky surface. He appeared in an explosion of green lightning on the plains of Anthrad. This expanse of open terrain divided the equatorial jungle from the Vulcanus mountains. Astride Big Reva, Wazdaka roared across ash wastes and alkali flats, drawing mobs of speed freaks from miles around. Columns of Astra Militarum soldiers retreating from the jungles were overrun. their transports and tanks obliterated in howling storms of Darker. Across Armageddon, the cohesion of Imperial armies began to collapse. Panic set in, and promising offensives became wholesale retreats. Wazdaka's assault. The Ork fleet had appeared in Armageddon's orbit without warning. Those strategos and commanders who retained a shred of wit in the following chaos surmised from eyewitness accounts that the Xenos had utilized some hitherto unseen form of teleportation technology. Before Armageddon's defenders could raise the alarm, Orks were streaming on to the planet's surface. From his flagship, Killwrecker, the Grand Warlord directed the onslaught. Wazdaka's Speedwar would form the spearhead of his conquest. Only when the cauldron of violence reached boiling point would Ghazghkull decide to join the fight. Wazdaka's objective, impressed on him by Ghazghkull at the business end of Gork's Claw, was the encirclement of High Vulcanus. To succeed at this goal and avoid stoking the Grand Warlord's ire, he would first need to break through the Volcanus Mountains. The Meridium and Orientum lines were the first fortifications in his path. They had been intended to prevent any advance across the plains of Anthrad from the direction of the equatorial jungle. Though the Krieg 547th Line Corps defended their positions with determination, the Orks' breakneck advance ploughed through their minefields and gun positions with relentless savagery. Big River seemed to be everywhere at once, a red blur of violent fury. Leading by example, Wazdaka steered his warbike through the trenches and bunkers. He crushed some enemies with his grabber-dragger and reduced others to red mist with torrents of Darker. A trail of corpses was left in his wake, mangled by tire tracks. In only minutes, the Orks had broken through the trench networks in a dozen places and pressed on. Wazdaka had no desire to get mired in a lengthy battle. He lived for speed as much as violence, and so the Speedwar ploughed on, burning a path towards High Vulcanus. Next in Wazdaka's path loomed the Liberation Line, constructed over the ruins of the South Primus Front, a far more formidable prospect than the Orientum and Meridium lines. This was the last set of static defensives shielding the crucial Mannheim Gap. Though its blockhouses and armoured watchtowers were still only partially constructed, the Liberation Line was heavily garrisoned. As the defenders took their positions, ash plumes appeared on the horizon, heralding the coming of the Speedwar. Soldiers hustled to foxholes and trench lines protected by expanses of minefields, barbed wire, tank traps, and funneling approaches covered by batteries of heavy weapons. As the warbands that comprised the assault force thundered towards the fortifications, Wazdaka barked commands to his speed bosses. Some peeled away to strike at the flanks, while the bulk of the Orks formed a gigantic wedge with Wazdaka at its tip. They sought to punch through the defences towards the hive beyond. A withering storm of fire heralded the Orks' charge. Orbiting cruisers unleashed bombardments that slammed down on the Liberation Line. Any lack of accuracy more than compensated for by sheer volume. Roaring air armadas swept down to drop their payloads, and the massed guns of battle wagons added their destructive might to the barrage as they thundered towards the cowering enemy. Projectiles corkscrewed through the heavens, exploding mid-air or detonating amongst the defenders to fling bodies dozens of feet in the air. The Orks were likewise subjected to sustained and devastating artillery fire. Shells rained down amidst the truck convoys and biker mobs, storms of shrapnel shredding green flesh and igniting fuel tanks and ammo. Through the clouds of fire and smoke came Wazdaka Gutsmech, the grin of his soot-covered face widening as the storm intensified. Overhead, bright red bombers thundered low to scatter their payloads amid the Imperial defenders. Wazdaka led a swathe of ramshackle Ork racers ahead of the Ork thrust, driving into the heart of the Imperial line. A furious volume of incoming fire smashed down amongst the vehicles. Several were struck, the rest came on, straight towards the most formidable defences. Astra Militarum soldiers and weapon crews looked on in consternation at the suicidal spear thrust. Their confusion only increased when the oncoming vehicles crackled a dazzling emerald white and disappeared in a flash. Seconds later, the roar of engines erupted in the midst of the defenders. Wazdacker and his shock-jump vanguard, cast through the warp by madcap Ork technology, were amongst them. Spiked wheels, axle saws, and metal plows scythed through ranks of soldiers. Big Reva's Psycho Gatler glowed hot as it spat hundreds of rounds into the screaming soldiery. As Wazdakker's assault drove home, beast snuggers of the Bloodscars tribe struck in the west, their ravenous squigs tearing chunks out of the enemy and reducing armored vehicles to piles of twisted scrap. To the east, the mechanized infantry of the Red Hands brute forced its way through layered and fortified minefields, preventing officers from diverting troops to seal the breach torn by Wazdakker's assault. As their slower-moving allies engaged the enemy in close combat, Wazdakker's speed freaks had broken through the liberation line in dozens of positions. Rattling Deathcopter squadrons, whooping warbike mobs, and armored blitz brigades left the flaming ruins of Imperial fortifications behind and converged once more in Wazdakker's wake. With the liberation line punctured, the path to High Volcanus lay open. Desperate stand. Imperial reinforcements were en route to the liberation line from High Volcanus. They comprised several experienced Cadian, Krieg, and Savlar mechanized infantry regiments, an entire Armageddon armored division, and a mass of conscripted Hive militia supported by 2 preceptories of the Order of Our Martyred Lady. These troops had reached Volcanus Ridge when panicked news of Wazdakker's breakthrough reached them. General Locke cursed within his command vehicle as he considered his options. Retreat towards the Mannheim Gap, and he risked being overrun by the heavily mobile Ork forces. Continue towards the liberation line, and his armies might be picked apart. In the end, the Orks decided for him. Reconnaissance units reported pillars of ash visible to the south, heading straight for the Mannheim Gap. There would be no avoiding a fight. After conferring with Caraness Preceptor Mercia, Locke offered a heartfelt prayer to the God Emperor that he was making the right decision, and ordered his forces to block the Orks' path. Battle of Volcanus Ridge. Wazdakker's speed war had been bolstered by fresh waves of speed freaks landing from orbit. Beyond the broken liberation line was Volcanus Ridge, an open expanse of heat-blasted desert dotted with rocks that jutted from the earth like jagged teeth. There was little cover to be had, and the ash clouds thrown up by General Locke's relief force were impossible to miss. Wazdacker turned Big Reva towards the incoming threat and accelerated hard, bellowing with glee as he pulled a flame-spewing wheelie that would make his gods proud. Trailing thick smoke and dust, the cacophonous tide of Orks met Locke's relief force head-on. First into the fray, Wazdacker wove through enemy armor, scything down dismounting troops and launching his grabber-dragger to snatch unwary crew members. War-track formations and blitz brigades followed, exchanging fire with tank squadrons. Evil Sun's boys leapt from their racing transports onto the hulls of enemy vehicles to pry open hatches and toss bundles of stick bombs into the midst of helpless crews. The far faster Ork vehicles engulfed the surrounding General Locke's spearhead, forcing the formations to stop in their tracks. Tanks and armored vehicles closed ranks, forming a circular perimeter around disembarking infantry, guns blazing to keep the hurtling Orks at bay. Wazdakker's speed war closed in, racing in a diminishing spiral, throwing up a tempest of ash and firing wildly as they came. Speeding warbikers plunged into the corral, their sheer blunt impact scattering soldiers. They hacked at their victims with rusty choppers. Tank busters engaged the Astra Militarum armor. Many were incinerated or blown into ragged showers of gore by battle cannon rounds, but enough reached their targets. Wazdakker's throttle rocket shocker propelled him into the midst of the foe and away again time after time. Each lightning strike left behind a trail of mutilated and tire-marked corpses. Emerging from his chimera, General Locke observed the unfolding chaos in horror. Any hope of relieving the liberation line had gone. Even managing to stage a fighting retreat to the Mannheim Gap would be nigh impossible. His forces were outmatched and barely holding their own. Only the Order of Our Martyred Lady was making any measure of progress, with Canoness Preceptor Mercia leaping into the fight alongside her elite Zephyrim and Intransia Frey's penitents charging into the encroaching foe with reckless fury. Their efforts alone, he knew, would not turn the tide. Already, his tanks had been almost eliminated, and the circling Orks were pressing the survivors into an ever-reducing pocket. Locke needed a miracle. A hero returned. Through the smoke of the battlefield, the roar of thrusters sounded. Beleaguered soldiers braced themselves, expecting a hail of bullets and bombs. Closer came the thunder, and an ember of hope glowed through the gloom. An armored gunship, its blue-grey hull emblazoned with the canine sigil of the Space Wars, swept low over the Orks. Black Valkyrie transports followed, door gunners pouring fire into the aliens. Tempestus Scions leaped from within, and grav chutes flaring as the drop troops opened fire mid-air. The Space Wars transport settled low over the surrounded guardsmen, its ramp opening. A trio of Space Marines emerged from within, howling battle cries as they poured bolter fire into the mass of Xenos. Yet it was the fourth figure to emerge that stunned the soldiery to silence. They witnessed a ghost. Most recognized Commissar at once. All of Armageddon's defenders knew tales of his deeds. They had learned of his duels with Ghazghul and his heroic defense of Hive Hades. But Yarrick was dead. The bell of lost souls had tolled. Still, there was no mistaking him. The lines of long centuries of war creased his grizzled features, yet he radiated the same intensity he had when he first took up arms against the Orks. His power cross snapped as he raised his storm bolter and turned his glowing bionic eye upon the Orkish hordes. His pallid, waxy visage twisted into a grimace. A shout went up. "The hero of Hades' Hive lives! Yarrick is returned!" A chorus of grunts and bellows passed among the Ork infantry. They too had noticed the Commissar. They knew old Baeli. He had slain Warboss Ugelhard in single combat, defied Ghazghul, and earned the Grand Warlord's respect. He was to them a figure of misfortune, a herald of death whose evil eye promised doom. Ork bosses bellowed and clouted, attempting to shake their underlings back into action as the Space Wars Thunderhawk engaged its thrusters and roared away, pursued by Xenos fighter craft. The Battle Sister seized the opportunity. Mortifiers, penitent engines, and Cestus Repentia carved a furrow through the Orks. Yarrick bellowed rallying cries, urging Astra Militarum soldiers to redouble their efforts. The Tempestus Scions took up firing positions, blasting Orks from saddles with their hotshot lasguns. Yarrick too waded into the fight, storm bolter roaring, and Baeli spitting las bolts. At the sight of his advance, confidence drained from the hordes. Pockets of warriors wavered and then fled. Yarrick's orders boomed from his Voxcaster, cutting through the din of explosions and gunfire, signaling a withdrawal. Wazdaka fumed. Not only had the fight slowed down, but now a good portion of his lads were legging it. Their flight afforded the Imperial forces the chance to withdraw. Only the Battle Sisters remained, pressing their momentary advantage against the wavering Ork hordes. Pushing Big Reva to its limits, Wazdaka plunged deeper into the fight, smashing his way through the Battle Sisters, chasing down the fleeing Astra Militarum vehicles. He zoomed towards the column, trailed by a wedge of hollowing warbikers. The turret of a Chimera turned, tracking him as he burned by. Wazdaka stood hard on his rear brake and threw his weight to one side, wrenching Big Reva into a power slide and angling towards the Imperial vehicle. Laser blasts fizzed through the air and struck the warbike's chassis, eliciting a gout of fire and a cloud of smoke. Beneath him, Big Reva chugged and hacked. Wazdaka smashed his handlebars in frustration as he ground to a halt. Wazdaka glowered and growled. Old Baeli was back and, worse still, had gotten away. Wazdaka didn't relish informing Ghazghul of this development. particularly considering how dead Yarrick was supposed to be. However, he had won a victory, of that much he was certain. The retreating Imperials had left more than 2/3 of their number strewn dead or wounded across Vulcanus Ridge. The rest wouldn't escape for long. Already, Fix-It was buried in a bag of spanners and bolts. Soon, Wazdacker would be on the move again. The retreat to High Vulcanus. The Battle of Vulcanus Ridge had been a disaster. General Locke's hastily assembled task force had failed to reach the Liberation line and relieve its beleaguered defenders, and had left more than half of its strength burning. The retreat towards High Vulcanus was undertaken in as orderly a manner as could be managed. Though Locke's forces had met with disaster at Vulcanus Ridge, the return of Commissar Yarrick had proven much-needed motivation. Small formations of Astra Militarum and Adepta Sororitas detached from the retreating columns and dug in to slow the Ork pursuit. Cries celebrating Yarrick's return echoed across Vox channels as soldiers fought and died to cover the retreat. At the Nasserine Flats, Colonel Curzon's 36th Krieg Infantry Regiment halted and turned their heavy weapons on the battle wagons of Dackerfist's Steel Eds, reducing the Speed Boys' Blitz Brigade to scrap before being overcome. Palatine Vermeera, meanwhile, led a counter-thrust west, almost reaching Armageddon Prime's western coast before her martyrdom. Such sacrifices, coupled with the temporary rout of many Orks, enabled Locke's retreating forces to get to the mouth of the Mannheim Gap ahead of the pursuing enemy. This narrow pass, bristling with defense fortifications, had been the focus of heavy fighting during previous conflicts. Though it remained a formidable defensive position, the Mannheim Gap was now more vulnerable than ever. With much of its standing garrison committed to battle elsewhere, and its complements of Titans and heavy armor depleted by decades of warfare. Leaving the bulk of their remaining forces, including Canoness Preceptor Mercia and her Zephyrim Elite, to defend the pass, Yarrick and Locke made for the safety of High Vulcanus' curtain walls. Back in the saddle. With Fix-It still completing hasty repairs, Wazdacker found himself lagging far behind his prey. He made as much haste for the Mannheim Gap as his battered steed would allow, trusting his Grot Oiler to restore Big River to full function. Eventually, as the mouth of the Mannheim Gap opened before him, a tap on the shoulder from Fix-It signaled that everything was back in order. The lights on his instrument panel flashed wildly, and Big River's engine roared. As Wazdacker engaged full throttle, the Speedwar coalesced around him again, overtaking and destroying straggling elements of Locke's columns before plunging into the mouth of the mountain pass. Here, the Orks were met by Astra Militarum super-heavy armor and the guns of the Vulcanus Mountain Space Defense Fortress. Wazdacker wove a path of destruction through ground-shattering barrages, guided his steel over jutting rocks, and boosted into the midst of dumbstruck enemies. He was in his element, lost in the thrill of high-octane destruction. Big River scattered ranked foes and shock-jumped amid storms of energy. The thick smog of fumes and rocket propellant settled low in the Mannheim Gap, shrouding all in noxious darkness. Mile by bloody mile, the Orks drove on, surging over and through their overwhelmed defenders. All attempts to arrest the momentum of the Speedwar were met with frustration. On the outskirts of the Gap, bugles sounded, heralding a mass charge of Death Rider squadrons. The Death Corps cavalry met Wazdacker's warbikes head-on, with frag lances leveled, blasting dozens of Orks from the saddle. In return, they were mowed down or dragged behind the steel tracks of gargantuan war engines. Canoness Mercia and her Zephyrim soared overhead, descending to skewer Ork riders and engage in aerial skirmishes with mobs of snarling storm boys. In response, Wazdacker guided Big River along a spur of jutting rock and took flight. His Psycho Gatler spat a hail of bullets and grenades, sending the Zephyrim plummeting to the ground. His Grabber Dragger shot out to ensnare the Canoness, its jaws closing around her trailing leg and dragging her in Wazdacker's wake, smashing her flailing body into jagged rocks and against tank traps. With each impact, Ceramite shattered and fragile bones broke, until the Cairness ceased struggling. Wazdaka cast her corpse aside. The walls of High Volcanus loomed out of the darkness as the Orks thundered towards the eastern mouth of the Mannheim Gap. It seemed that nothing could halt their relentless advance. Ignominious retreat. Reaching the gates of High Volcanus, ahead of Wazdaka's Orks, Commissar Yarrick, Dogmata Superior Frey, and General Locke bore grim tidings to the Council of Armageddon. Reports flooding in from the planet's other hives were equally dire. Hell's Reach, Acheron, Tartarus, all were besieged. Even mighty Hive Infernus was surrounded by Orks. The continuing flow of water and promethium from the Deadlands suggested that the Space Marines had met with some success, though all attempts to raise them had been returned with silence. As Yarrick addressed the council, former allies noted his elderly body, ravaged by time and war, was supported by an exoskeleton, and his skin bore a sickly sheen reminiscent of an embalmed corpse. However, he spoke with intensity and intelligence, warning that Armageddon could not stand alone against the Ork tides. Its armies had faced only the first waves of the Ork onslaught. Ghazghul was coming. If Armageddon was to be saved, then a call for aid had to be sent off-world, one loud and urgent enough to cut through the psychic cacophony ringing out through the rest of the subsector. Unsealing an ancient portable reliquary, Yarrick withdrew a gold-plated servo skull. This was, he explained, the Pharis Horrifica. The macabre device floated before the council, a mist of scented holy water rising from thuribles that dangled from its lower cables. Yarrick claimed that it had been crafted from the cranium of a master astropath, engraven with the sigil of the Astra Telepathica. The Pharis Horrifica would act as both a focus and a beacon for the astropathic choir's ritual of sending, lacing their psychic messages with symbolistic significance, and ensuring that they would cut through any warp turbulence and the innumerable astropathic distress cores being emitted from the many worlds in this subsector. Yarrick claimed that this would enable High Volcanus' astropathic choir to send a priority signal that would be certain to grasp the attention of sector commanders, Space Marine chapters, and myriad other Imperial forces. With the God Emperor's blessing, Armageddon may be saved. All Yarrick required was an escort to the astropathic relay. With the council in agreement, Yarrick departed. Governor von Ruger and a squad of Tempestus Scions in tow for the astropathic relay. However, even if the Commissar's words were to be believed and reinforcements were summoned, Armageddon Prime would still need to be stabilized. Graves, incandescent with rage at the abject failure of Armageddon's military leadership, pointed the finger of blame squarely at General Locke. His initial hesitation and inaction in the face of Xenos aggression had, she accused, cost them victory. Before the general could protest his innocence, Graves drew her pistol and shot Armageddon's most senior officer dead, much to the horror of many in the council chamber. Graves quelled their protestations with an icy glare. Now was no time for hesitation or mercy. Armageddon needed a ruthless leader, one who would accept death before defeat. Thus, as Locke's corpse was dragged from the chamber, Marshal Gorman of the Death Corps of Krieg was appointed in his stead. Gorman was a coldly calculating commander, whose pitiless mathematical methods of waging war appealed to her own callous sensibilities. He would provide the blunt and unimaginative defiant leadership High Volcanus required to hold the Orks at bay. Dark Revelation. The whine of servo motors and the clang of booted feet on metal floors echoed through the empty corridors of High Volcanus' central spire. The nobility were conspicuous by their absence. In Armageddon's hour of need, no citizen had been spared the draft. Only the governor, his elite guard, and a skeleton crew of servitors remained within the palatial districts. Flanked on either side by grim-faced Militarum Tempestus soldiers, Commissar Yarrick followed the diminutive form of Governor Agmund von Ruger towards the reinforced blast doors of the highest astropathic sanctum. The Farus Horrifica drifted ominously above his left shoulder. A pair of troopers and a major stood before the doors, lasguns held across their chests, eyes fixed forward. They snapped to attention at the governor's approach. The major offered a sharp salute, eyes darting nervously towards the Tempestus Scions. Von Ruger dismissively waved him aside. "Open the doors, Major," he said. "We have an urgent message for relay." The major moved to the panel on the left side of the door. His gloved hand flashed across the controls. With the sounds of grinding mechanisms, the doors slowly slid open. Beyond, another long, dark corridor stretched away. Lumens blinked to life along its length. At the far end of the corridor stood another set of reinforced doors, inlaid with the iconography of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The Steel Legion Major led them towards the blast doors, withdrawing an ornately decorated code cylinder from his breast pocket as he marched. Yarrick and von Ruger followed closely. The 5 Tempestus Scions trailed behind. Reaching the far end of the corridor, the Major approached the servitor wired into the stone and metal frame of the doorway. It twitched into wakefulness at his presence, milky white eyes opening to meet the Major's gaze. Its Vox unit emitted a wail of static. "Major Gerard Vernon, clearance Scion Alpha," the Major said. "Open communications with the Sanctum Guards." The servitor twitched again, its mechanisms humming as the Vox channel opened. There was no response. The Major's brow furrowed. He spoke again. "Muller, Vren, do you copy? Open the door! Clearance Scion Alpha!" Again, nothing but static. The Major turned to regard Yarrick and von Ruger, looking concerned. "Strange. Perhaps a mechanical issue. I will have to raise Magos Hearn for an override," he said, reaching for his Vox bead. "We have no time for that, Major. Step aside," von Ruger replied. The governor approached the panel. He withdrew a small cylinder from a fold of his gown and unsealed its cap, revealing a needle-like protrusion within. He pressed his palm against the spike. A rivulet of blood ran from his hand into the reservoir at the base of the device. Lifting a panel beneath the servitor's torso, he connected the cylinder to a socket within. "Override. Agmund von Ruger, Vulcanus Cryptus Vermilion, 953, he said loudly and clearly. The servitor's head bobbed again, letting out a binaric acknowledgement. Gears clicked and whirred. The gilded door slid open. As it did so, the Tempestus Scions shifted, readying their weapons. Yarrick was the first to cross the threshold. His eye was immediately drawn to the shimmering pool at the heart of the circular chamber. It was illuminated by a pillar of light, filtered through a glaciaic dome in the center of the vaulted ceiling. 2 corpses bobbed face down, their blood staining the blessed waters crimson. Alabaster sculptures ringed the pool, most of which had been shattered by gunfire and daubed with crude glyphs. Banks of techno-arcane machinery had been ripped and blasted open, sparking cables trailing from their innards. The acrid stench of burning electronics mixed with the coppery tang of spilt blood. Yarrick strode forward into the chamber, scanning the alcoves. The emaciated bodies of the choir's astropaths had been wrenched from their stations and hacked apart in a savage frenzy. Severed limbs and ragged, butchered flesh lay everywhere. Arterial sprays drenched the walls and floors with rivers of crimson that had now pooled on the flagstones. A crackling static energy hung in the air, the smell of burning ozone and sulfur betraying the collapse of the chamber's hexagrammatic wards. Yarrick knew immediately that the relay was beyond use. No message would leave Armageddon from here. Von Ruger gasped as he entered behind Yarrick and gazed upon the slaughter. He raised a hand to his mouth, visibly fighting back the urge to vomit. "Emperor, protect us," he whispered. The Tempestus Scions moved ahead of Yarrick, inspecting the remains of the astropathic choir, probing, prodding, and testing. "They have not been dead for long. A few hours at most," the sergeant said, gesturing to the torso of a butchered astropath. "How could this have happened?" said the major, his voice barely a whisper. "We received no warning of a breach. The blast door has been sealed since the last sending. There is no other access point." "Ork infiltrators," a second scion said. "Judging by these wounds." Yarrick moved deeper into the cavernous chamber. His eyes began to adjust to the darkness. Striding around the central pool, he moved to the far side of the sanctum. The skulls of long-dead astropaths coated the wall, interred here to watch over their living successors. Amidst the wall of skulls, marble tableaux depicted scenes from Armageddon's past. Yet it was not the delicate carving that drew Yarrick's eye. A crude glyph had been drawn in blood. As far as Yarrick could tell, it depicted a bloody dagger. Above the sigil, daubed in feet-high letters, a taunting phrase had been scrawled across the pale stonework, one that spoke the malicious cunning of the Ork invaders. "No escape." A desperate gambit. The sabotage of High Volcanus' astropathic relay and the slaughter of its choir forced a reappraisal of the Imperial War effort. Volcanus, Yarrick estimated, could hold out for weeks, perhaps even months, but not indefinitely. Armageddon's other hives were likely suffering just as severely. Priority message still needed to be sent, one that could only be transmitted with the aid of the Farus Horrifica. Armageddon was somewhat unusual amongst Imperial worlds. In no fewer than 4 of its hives contained astropathic relays. However, due to ever-increasing Ork air superiority, those at Hive Infernus and Hive Hellsreach were well beyond Yarrick's range. Any attempt to journey there by land would require crossing the smouldering equatorial jungle. Realistically, only the relay station at Hive Death Mire was within Yarrick's reach. The high-priority distress signal could still be dispatched if the Farus Horrifica could be transported there and handed over to the choir. However, given the sheer volume of Orks pressing towards High Volcanus and swarming across the plains of Anthrond, simply breaking through the gathering encirclement would be difficult enough, let alone evading them for more than 1,000 miles. Aided by Greys, Marshal Gorman and dozens of High Volcanus' most experienced strategos, Yarrick set about plotting a method of reaching the distant hive. The swiftest route to Deathmire would be to drive east, crossing the Volcanus Bridge before swinging south along the Volcanus Highway. However, this plan presented several problems. With the Orks beginning to filter through the Mannheim Gap and scramble over the Volcanus Mountains, the hive was already largely surrounded. To punch through the burgeoning siege, Yarrick and his allies would have to commit a force of considerable size and strength. An armoured convoy of the sort required could not filter out of the gates unnoticed, and even if it did, could scarcely hope to overrun Wazdakka's highly mobile warbands. In addition, the Ork encirclement would be but the first of several obstacles to overcome. The Volcanus Hiveway would take the relief convoy past Hive Tempestora, the domain of the capricious Bad Moon's war boss, Agrok Glitztooth. It was likely that he, too, would pose a threat. Thus, Yarrick's armoured fist would need prodigious firepower in addition to speed. Having conducted a thorough evaluation and brutal reconstruction of High Volcanus' military leadership, Graves recommended the boldest, most aggressive and most loyal of tank commanders to lead the breakout force. Buying time. What was required for the plan to succeed, Dogmata Superior Frey pointed out, was a distraction. And so, as Commissar Yarrick set about requisitioning the vehicles and troops required, she, Graves and Gorman began mustering a second force. It needed none of the speed and mobility of Yarrick's armoured spearhead. It instead required firepower and resilience. It would be a blunt anvil upon which the Orks would hurl themselves until they, or it, shattered. Led forth from the city walls by Greys, this blocking force would engage the gathering Orks directly. It would attack on a narrow front, smashing into Wazdakka's encroaching speed war and distracting it long enough for Yarrick's armour to exit the sated gate and punch through whatever resistance remained in his sector. From there, Yarrick would cross the Volcanos Bridge and be well on his way to High Fleet Deathmire before the sidetracked Orks could organize a coordinated pursuit. By the time Graves, Gorman and Frey had begun mustering the soldiers and materiel required, news of Canis Preceptor Mercia's demise had filtered back to High Volcanos. Her death had seen the partial collapse of the Mannheim Gap's fortifications, sending waves of desperate, battle-worn troops flooding back to the relative safety of Volcanos' gates. If these exhausted soldiers had hoped for a reprieve from combat, they would be bitterly disappointed. Shattered formations of Cadians, Kriegsmen, Semtexians and Mordians were formed into understrength battalions, some composed entirely of the walking wounded. These troops were absorbed into Graves' rapidly swelling strike force. The swiftest, most reliable and hardest hitting of High Volcanos' armoured vehicles had been placed under Yarrick's command. For the diversionary assault, Marshal Gorman and his logisticians assembled several companies from those that could be spared from Yarrick's entourage. These were comprised almost entirely of Lehman Russ battle tanks, crewed by grizzled veterans with experience fighting Orks. 2 lances from House Terran would join them, as well as a patchwork of lightly armoured transport vehicles, repurposed artillery tractors and industrial vehicles that could be laden with Hive militia and untested regiments of freshly equipped conscripts. The guns of the Krieg 551st Siege Regiment, positioned atop the Hive southern walls, would supplement the heavy cannons built into the outer shell, providing additional artillery firepower. The remaining battle sisters of the Order of our Martyred Lady were now under the direct command of their Dogmata Superior. Perceiving the retreat from the plains of Anthrand as an unforgivable failure, Frey now demanded that her sisters atone for the calamity. The zealous warriors, eager for redemption, would add additional punch to Graves' forces. Even so, they would be significantly outnumbered by their enemies. The largest concentration of Orks had begun to mass beyond the Hive southern gate, and still they poured out of the Mannheim Gap in their teeming hordes. It was there that Wazdacker had been most recently spotted, weaving through the perimeter defences like a dynamo of destruction and leading constant probing assaults against outlying fortifications. It was in this direction that Graves would throw her feint. By striking near the Mannheim Gap, the diversionary assault would, it was hoped, appear to the enemy as a legitimate attempt to relieve besieged allies and recapture the pass. This would force the Orks to give battle, or risk their valuable route of reinforcement and resupply being closed upon them. With the strategy decided, Graves and Gorman turned to rallying their battle-fatigued soldiers. Though her evaluation and pruning of High Volcanos' command structure had been thorough, Graves feared that defeatism and cowardice were endemic among some of her units, and so determined that she and her officio prefectus retinue, her so-called right hand, would need to be at the front line to maintain order. She would oversee the fighting from the pulpit of her armoured and heavily modified Centaur RSV Vigilance. Thus, as Commissar Yarrick's armoured column assembled within High Volcanos' walls, Commissar Graves, Marshal Gorman and Dogmata Superior Frey formed at their units inside the Hive's eastern curtain wall and awaited the signal to strike. Sallying forth. With a thunderous groan of ancient machinery, High Volcanos' reinforced gates swung open, and from the innards of that great hive surged forth an avalanche of steel. At the forefront rode Commissar Graves aboard Vigilance, with a power gauntlet Manus Mortis raised high, and the gilded prow of her custom Centaur RSV forming the point of an armoured wedge. She plunged into Wazdakker's massed Orks like the tip of a sharpened bayonet. Preceded by a barrage of heavy artillery fire, the first wave of the diversionary assault pummeled its way through hastily constructed Ork siege works outside High Volcanos. Many of these positions had only recently been vacated by Imperial defenders and were yet to be fully garrisoned by the aliens. Rogel-Dawn tanks, still bearing myriad scars from past conflicts, ground over trench lines, Sponson flamers immolating Orks as they scrambled to bring crude weapons to bear. Vigilance smashed into a group of buggies, Chiron Gatling cannon blazing. Graves' squad, her right hand, firing stubber bursts. The vehicle's prow threw the smaller enemy vehicles aside. Some burst into flames, crews and passengers scrambling desperately to free themselves from the burning wreckage. Centaur RSVs moved forward to support the assault, Pintle gunners covering debussing soldiers. Graves drew her power saber and held it aloft. Her vox-amplified war cries thundering over the cacophonous din of armoured warfare, encouraging her infantry forward. Marshal Gorman's Death Riders continued the assault, their augmented steeds scrambling over razor wire and partially collapsed structures. The riders plunged through channels in the Imperial armour formations, with frag lances lowered. They slammed into clustered Ork mobs in storms of shrapnel, riding roughshod over their foes. Fallen Orks were trampled to a bloody pulp. Teams of heavy weapons rushed into liberated positions, hauling corpses aside and swiftly setting up mortars and other large guns with which to support the advance. Krieg infantry ran forwards with bayonets fixed, reoccupying trenches and pouring lethal volleys of lasgun fire and flamer bursts into retreating mobs. From the south and north, pillars of ash rose, and the growl of Ork engines grew louder as speed mobs converged on this latest source of entertainment. The Death Corps soldiers who had led the assault fought with the self-sacrificial fury for which they were renowned, needing little encouragement from their commanders. With pinpoint firepower and desperate bayonet charges, they cut a red swathe through a sea of green, dragging less experienced and motivated warriors forward in their wake. Amid swirling ash and biting dust, the surprised Orks attempted to mount a counterattack. War bikes careened forward as looted tanks rumbled behind. A smoke-belching truck thundered towards Vigilance, forcing Commissar Graves' driver into a sharp turn. There was a squeal of steel on steel as the two vehicles collided, hulls scraping together. A trio of Ork boarders leapt onto Vigilance's armoured pulpit. Graves' power fist Manus Mortis found the jaw of one, shattering bones, splintering tusks, and knocking the Ork overboard to be crushed beneath rolling tracks. The second cut down Graves' Voxman before her power sword took out its throat. The third clambered onto the cabin, chopper raised to strike, only to be riddled with holes by the Pintle gunner. Then the truck peeled away, disappearing into an obscuring curtain of poisonous dust. The fighting was brutal. Vehicles, both Ork and Imperial, crashed and burned, sending up thick columns of smoke visible from miles away. Eventually, the might of Graves' armoured spearhead told, and the remaining Orks broke, changing course and heading towards the Mannheim Gap. Vibrant signal rockets arced overhead, their explosions and trailing clouds of smoke adding colour to blackened skies as the speed mobs retreated over the horizon. Graves observed the flares with a satisfied nod. The Orks would be back. Her plan counted upon it. Marshal Gorman's infantry were busy mopping up the last pockets of Ork resistance left behind by the retreating speed freaks. With the feint thrown, the next stage of Grace's plan moved into action. Sisters Hospitaller and Astra Militara Medicae made their way through hastily dug trenches and foxholes, tending to the wounded, offering ministrations to the doomed, and handing out combat stems. Death Corps combat engineers and penal troops laboured to shore up trench lines and dig firing pits for armoured vehicles. Corpses, scrap metal, and the wrecks of war machines were piled in front of tanks to obscure their silhouettes and arranged to form barricades behind which field artillery could be concealed. The tanks and retributor squads of the Order of Our Martyred Lady took up firing positions, and Augmata Superior Frey glowered at the toiling troops from atop her ambulatory pulpit of judgment, the throne of blame. She bellowed the tenets of the Order of Our Martyred Lady, leaving her battle sisters in no doubt as to the sacrifice demanded of them. Mortifiers and Repentia chained to her throne served as a reminder of the fate awaiting anyone who failed to live up to her exacting standards. Reconnaissance platoons fanned out ahead of the defensive positions, sentinels stalked forward, auspicators scanning for signs of Ork movement. It would not be long before the first reports of incoming aliens hissed across Vox channels, and gunfire rang out once more. A desperate feint. At the eastern mouth of the Mannheim Gap, pockets of Imperial resistance remained as islands in the endless stream of Ork speedsters. Dozens of broad channels had been blasted through the layered minefields, trench networks, and bunker clusters that defended this crucial pass. Speeding along these newly hewn racetracks, Wazdacker was in his element. He powered through the melee, pulling wheelies and unleashing wild fusillades from his Psycho Gatler. Behind him, Fixit busied himself patching Big Reva's chassis, clinging on while welding loose scrap over bullet holes. Wazdacker turned his gaze west. A trio of crimson flares lit the sky, and his shouting box began to growl with reports of a counterattack. He smiled. Just as the fun seemed set to end, Gork and Mork had sent him fresh entertainment. Barking at Fixit to top up his squig oil, he hollered commands and accelerated towards the new scrap. He ran into retreating Orks first, shaking his grabber-dragger furiously. A good portion was swept up in his wake, turning to follow as he plunged towards the oncoming Imperials. From the south, over the Volcanus Mountains, the exhaust plumes of squadrons of Deathcopters darkened the skies. As the Orks thundered through the foothills and Badlands towards Volcanus, small Astra Militarum reconnaissance units engaged them from the flanks. Sentinels and Hippogriff AFVs used any cover they could while picking off targets, while elite Cadian recon squads and Steel Legion veterans sought to draw the advancing Orks into ambushes. Yet these efforts were little more than irritants to the speed freaks. They barely stopped to engage the foe. Great battle fortresses turned their prodigious munitions on the Imperials, Ork gunners whooping as their deafening barrages showered the soldiers with lethal shrapnel, while Deathcopters obliterated light armor. Wazdakker's counterattack. Descending onto the flatter ground at High Volcanus' southern fringe, the Orks stormed headlong into Marshal Gorman's prepared positions. From their concealed vantage points and hull-down positions, Lehman Russ tanks and field artillery pieces opened fire. Battle cannon shells smashed into the lead wave of Orks, throwing up ash clouds and pillars of flame. Scrap metal and wreckage soared into the air and bounced haphazardly through the Ork advance, throwing bikers aside and pitching them under the wheels of larger vehicles. Death Corps and Atalan cavalry units charged in from the flanks, meeting Squighog boys and war bikers in headlong charges that pitched riders from both sides from their saddles. Still, the artillery continued to fire. The Malleus rockets screamed down to smash into the Ork advance. Through the conflagration came Wazdacker Gutsmech, a blur of crimson, lurid green lightning and curtains of flame. The roar of Big Reva's engine drowned out the carnage, primal snarl reverberating through the bones of all who heard it. Then he was among the defenders, warbikers in tow. Small arms fire cracked and pinged from Big Reva's steel hide. Scores of Ork vehicles were torn asunder by their opening barrages, pinwheeling away, ammunition cooking off in crackling detonations. The remainder ploughed on. Battle wagons swung wrecking balls as they passed, staving in sponson turrets and decapitating tank commanders as they sought to return fire with pintle weapons. Wazdacker plunged into the heart of the enemy like a hypersonic missile. Loud crashes, explosions, and pain screams followed his path of destruction. As the wave of Orks washed over them, the remainder of Graze's armored assets, arranged in concentric lines with overlapping fields of fire, opened up. Death Corps and Steel Legion infantry dug in around the remaining strongpoints, swiveled weapon emplacements, and blasted away at oncoming Ork vehicles. Damaged trucks and battle wagons slewed to a halt, causing pile-ups. Under heavy fire, Ork infantry scrambled from broken transports and sprinted towards the enemy. Many were cut down, felled by the precision bolt gun fire of battle sisters, or maimed by mortar rounds. Commissar Graves observed the conflict with grim satisfaction. By now, Yarrick's convoy would have left High Volcanus' walls. Her primary objective had already been achieved. All that remained was to tie the Orks down for as long as possible. She climbed from Vigilance's bullet-scarred pulpit and leapt into a trench filled with filth-encrusted soldiers, all prepared to meet the inevitable Xenos assault. Graves doubted that many of them would live the day, but by the Emperor, they would do their duty. The Green Tide. Wazdaka's speed mobs had plunged deep into the heart of the Imperial positions, punching through several lines of concealed armor and overrunning forward artillery batteries. Now they found their path blocked by obstinate infantry. Worse, though Wazdaka and his lead units had smashed the center of the Imperial line, they had neglected to clear the flanks. More concealed armor opened up, pouring withering fire into the jumbled convoy of Ork speedsters. Roaring in frustration, Wazdaka barked gruff commands to those speed bosses close enough to hear, ordering them to silence these threats. Mobs peeled away from under heavy fire, weaving through smoldering wreckage. In the center, where the battle was most intense, Graves found herself embroiled in bitter close-quarters combat. Masses of Orks, their vehicles unable to maneuver, had disembarked and were now swarming on foot towards the trenches and half-ruined bunkers, clambering over the corpses of their allies. Bellowing encouragement to surrounding troops, Graves and her right hand joined in repelling the Orks with bolt pistol and saber. To the east, Dogmata Superior Frey and her battle sisters continued to repel wave after wave of Ork attackers. Singing wrathful prayers, the Order of our martyred lady warriors fought relentlessly. Ornate exorcist artillery tanks fired arcing barrages of missiles that rained the God Emperor's judgment upon the aliens. Each time the Orks surged forward, ranks of battle sisters rose from cover to fell the enemy with hails of bolt gun fire. Those few to Xenos close upon them felt the wrath of flamers, flesh melted away by streams of liquid fire. Intransia Frey was always amid the carnage, the throne of blame striding into the bloody melee, heavy bolters and flamers annihilating entire mobs. Her bellicose denunciation sealed the fate of many a hulking knob and rampaging speed boss. Frenzied mortifiers and sisters Repentia fell upon those she marked for death, hacking down their enemies in a zealous rage, seeking redemption in the slaughter. The penitents carved gore-flecked channels into the alien ranks before they fell beneath the hordes and were slain in their turn. The Orks pressed forward, burner boys clambering from the backs of trucks, howling gleeful battle cries and shouldering one another aside in their desire to set everything around them alight. Soldiers stumbled from their foxholes or scrambled from bunkers to escape the inferno, only to be hacked to pieces by rampaging mobs of boys or trampled beneath the clawed feet of Squig cavalry. Less than a mile away, commandos emerged unseen from the foothills of the Volcanus Mountains, outflanking the Imperial defences, infiltrating rearward positions and putting enemy officers to the sword. Marshal Gorman barely avoided such a fate, escaping his command bunker only thanks to the heroic self-sacrifice of his Grenadier Guard. Meanwhile, Wazdaka and his speed mobs continued penetrating static defense lines, their lighter, faster vehicles evading fire from dug-in armor, tossing stick bombs and firing point-blank rocket barrages to clear the wings. Slowly but surely, Graves and Frey found their surviving forces pressed into an ever-reducing pocket, at imminent threat of being surrounded. Tactical withdrawal. Smashing a hulking knob aside, Commissar Graves snatched a moment to check her wrist chrono. The Orks had been frustrated longer than she had anticipated, but with a glance around her, she saw the overstretched Imperial forces could not hold the line much longer. Withdrawing from the fight, she led her bodyguard back aboard Vigilance. As the armoured vehicle's prow-mounted Gatling cannon spun to life, its salvos keeping encroaching Orks at bay, she sent a series of abrupt Vox messages to her allies. Those capable of doing so were to retreat to High Volcanus immediately. To suffer further losses would only impede the defense of the High City. Those unable to retreat were to fight to the last soldier, taking solace in their lives being spent doing their duty. Dogmata Superior Frey acknowledged the message curtly. Her sisters would stage a fighting withdrawal, Marshal Gorman's reply was equally abrupt. He would make his last stand alongside his soldiers. For the Death Corps, there would be no retreat. Graves' second order, issued as Vigilance's engines roared back to life, was to the artillery batteries positioned atop the Hive's outermost curtain walls. They were to begin a saturation bombardment of the front lines immediately. Vigilance ploughed through masses of encroaching Orks and drove towards High Volcanus. As the walls loomed before her, Graves glanced towards the abandoned positions. Muzzle flashes, pin-prick lasgun beams, and gouts of flame illuminated the battlefield as the first artillery shells landed. Debris soared high into the air, thunderous creeping barrages deafening soldiers miles distant from their impact. Behind the curtain of death, the shattered remnants of Graves' armored formation limped to the temporary safety of High Volcanus. As the skies darkened with the volume of shells, and explosions rippled through their ranks, soldiers scrambled desperately onto the hulls of retreating tanks. Many more piled into the few remaining armored transports. Those forced to flee on foot trailed desperately behind in winding columns that lengthened as the wounded and spent fell behind. Most would never reach the walls of Volcanus. They collapsed with wounds or simple exhaustion, to be buried beneath drifting dunes of acid ash, were crushed by the tracks of Dogmata Superior Frey's withdrawing transports, or were cut down by pursuing Orks. Less than an eighth of those who had left High Volcanus mere hours earlier would live to see the Hive again. The Martyr's Path. Even as Gorman and Graves' diversionary battle raged, Commissar Yarrick's relief column thundered from the Saint's Gate in High Volcanus' southern flank. A prodigious armored formation moving at speed under heavy escort, every soldier within it knew their mission was nothing less than the salvation of Armageddon. It was a truth that filled their hearts with fear and determination. Under the iconic leadership of Yarrick, they would prevail or die trying. When the Sainted Gate swung wide, it surprised the scattered bands of speed freaks racing around outside. They were mobs of chancers and cunning gits who figured that, with both the humans and Wazdaka causing such a ruckus to the north, they would be able to get some sneaky looting and racing done. Their leader was the Death Skull speed boss, Grizzsnag. From his battle wagon, he had directed his warbikers and truck-riding looters to overrun the battered fortifications that guarded this sector of High Volcanus' exterior. The depleted Kriegsmen handling these defenses had sold their lives dearly to repel the avaricious Orks. However, their resistance had been winnowed to a few pockets of survivors, or surrounded by whooping, racing aliens. Many Death Skull mobs had already abandoned the fight in favor of picking over corpses and hooking vehicle wrecks to chain hauls. Artillery fire still fell amongst them from Volcanus' batteries, but to Grizzsnag, that just lent the whole business a welcome frisson of excitement. The bronze carvings of imperial heroes and martyrs that decorated the gate's outer face parted to reveal real flesh and blood warriors of the Emperor, riding aboard heavily armored vehicles. Their vanguard comprised convoys of Hippogriff AFVs, Centaur RSVs, packed with Cadian shock troops, and every Hellhound and Banewolf that hadn't been sent away with the ill-fated Purgation Corps. Behind these came scores of heavier vehicles. There was squadron upon squadron of Leman Russ battle tanks, and companies of mechanized infantry aboard Chimeras and Tauroxes. Formations of heavier Rogol Dawns, Wyverns, and tight clades of Adeptus Mechanicus fuel and ammunition carriers added to the convoy. Knights of House Terran and Hawkshroud loped alongside the armored column. Valkyries and vultures of the Navis Imperialis roared overhead. Meanwhile, at the heart of the formation rumbled an ornate black-armored Baneblade, upon whose hull was blazoned the name Fortress of Arrogance. Flanking this war engine like faithful sentinels came a pair of Legio Metallica Warhound Titans, Lupex Destructor and Hound of Hades. Warboss Grizzsnag started bellowing orders for his mobs to form up and get ready to meet the charge head-on. He was still yelling into his shouting tubes when Hound of Hades seared the warboss, his battle wagon, and everything within 50 yards of it into glowing ash. The tanks of Yarrick's column drove through the scattered and leaderless Orks like a power glaive through scrap iron. Hippogriffs raced in, bullets and explosive projectiles spanging from their hulls as their turret guns spat fire. Hellhounds sent jets of blazing promethium in long arcs to scour mobs of looters from trenches the Orks themselves had stormed minutes before. Some vehicles detonated as rockets punched through their armored hulls. Others slewed off course as stick bombs shredded their tracks. Yet the Orks might as well have tried to halt an avalanche. With the inspiring words of Yarrick ringing through their vox speakers and headsets, the crews mowed down the Orks that barred their way and powered on through the outer defense works. Surviving Kriegsmen offered grim salutes before beginning the work of heaping bodies to plug gaps. They were still toiling when, long minutes later, the column's tail left the sainted gate. Gradually, the dust storm raised by the Imperial war engines began to settle. Yet, from the ramparts of High Vulcanus, vigilant eyes saw other dust plumes moving on the horizon, converging to intercept Yarrick's column. The race to Hive Deathmire had begun. The burning highway. Yarrick's armoured column stormed across the Vulcanus bridge without slowing. The structure was cyclopean, wide enough to accommodate a score of traffic lanes side by side. A handful of warbiker mobs had claimed the bridge and were racing each other up and down its length. They hauled their motorized steeds around with whoops of glee and raced to meet the Astra Militarum vanguard. But the fight was brief and one-sided. Imperial tanks ground the wrecks beneath their treads and shouldered aside the scrap barricades across the bridge's far end. Moments later, Commissar Yarrick's force was speeding towards Deathmire. The highway the Imperial force now followed would lead them straight to Deathmire. Yarrick's column would be exposed, ever more so where the highway curved away from the looming mass of the Vulcanus Mountains and out into the wastes. Even in times of comparative peace, this desolate region was always dangerous. Storms of choking ash and corrosive pollutant smog were a constant hazard. They could engulf a stretch of highway in minutes, reducing visibility to mere feet and unprotected bodies to bubbling flesh. Water and fuel were nowhere to be had, except at a handful of way stations along the highway that Strategos assumed were now under Ork control. The column's air cover, in particular, would be forced to break off repeatedly during the journey and boost up to the stratosphere to perform risky rendezvous with marauders modified for refueling. Meanwhile, there was nothing to be done about the colossal tail of dust the Imperial convoy raised as it sped across the wastes. In places, the highway was barely less layered with ash than the landscape through which it travelled. Thus, as they raced south towards Deathmire, the Imperial vehicles raised a banner of debris and smoke that could be seen for miles. Speeding interceptors. It did not take long for Orks to appear. As the highway sloped down from a raised embankment, a cult of speed swung in from the west to keep pace with Yarrick's column. Bellowing oaths through their voxmitters, nobles of House Terran bore down on the Orkoid vehicles. One, a knight paladin named Bane of Heresy, plunged a foot into a deep well of sinking ash and crashed down to be left in the column's wake. The other knight smashed into the midst of the cult of speed and scattered its vehicles in all directions. Yet, even as the knights broke up one enemy formation, another convoy of speeders arced in from the east, intersecting violently with the Imperial vehicles. Sponsons chattered as warbikes wove between the tanks, riders clamping tankbuster bombs to armoured hulls before speeding clear of the blasts. A swarm of deathcopters thumped low to loose bombs and rockets. Chimeras and Centaur RSVs swerved off the highway, belching flames from ruptured crew compartments. A Lehman Russ Punisher was flipped into the air by a hit to its fuel tanks. The stricken vehicle crashed atop a pair of Toroxes before all three vanished in a ball of fire. With the lighter vehicles in amongst them and heavier gun wagons levelling harassing fire from the plains, the Imperial tank crews were in trouble. Worse, the speed mobs to the west had reformed around the Knight's charge, some coming about to tie up the furious nobles, while the rest strafed the convoy. Yarrick ordered all heavy firepower directed outward to deal with the enemies to their flanks. Meanwhile, he commanded the hippogriffs to drop back from the vanguard and weave through the Imperial formations, using their maneuverability and firepower to pick off bikers. Their efforts were supported by hails of fire from the hull-mounted lasguns of the Chimeras and pintle-mounted weapons, as tank crew members risked the toxic atmosphere to emerge from their cupolas and fire. Many suffered for their bravery. One by one, however, the bikes and lighter buggies detonated. Some tumbled to a flaming halt and were left behind in the dust. Others swerved and were crushed under steel treads. Meanwhile, battle cannon shells and plasma bursts lashed at the cult of speed to either side of the highway. Lightly armored Ork vehicles detonated, rolling and cartwheeling as luckless crews and shredded metal spun away. Others plunged into craters blasted before them and came to a sudden, crunching stop. Evening drew in, and the fight was swinging in the Imperium's favor when the droning mass of Ork fighters and bombers swept in from the east. Arrayed in the clan colors of the Goths and Bad Moons, many bore the glyphs of Warlord Glitztooth on their fuselages. The Flyboy Menace. Yarrick's escort of Valkyries and Vultures swooped away to intercept the swarming Ork planes, their thrusters coughing in the ash-choked air. The polluted skies rippled with explosions as the two forces met. Hydra flak tanks adding fire from below as their autocannon turrets swiveled. Ork planes were blown apart. Some spiraled down, trailing flames and smoke to smash into the highway. Others engaged the Imperial gunships in brutal dogfights, while many more performed near-suicidal evasive maneuvers before diving steeply to execute blistering attack runs. Much reduced, the Navis Imperialis escort wings doubled back. Their las blasts and rockets, combined with the storm of flak rising from the wounded Imperial convoy, were enough to drive off or destroy the last of the Ork planes. At the same time, the pounding of the big guns sent the speed freaks racing into the wastes to hunt for easier prey. Yarrick's column had endured the first true running battle of their mission. As their strung-out formation sought to reform its ranks, they left dozens of burning wrecks and crippled vehicles in their wake. The wrecks were swiftly swallowed by the gloom of night. There was no time to stop and recover survivors or salvage fuel and ammunition. Yarrick was painfully aware that every minute wasted risked utter failure. Soul-sick and feeling more than ever that Armageddon was some titanic beast forever hungry for the bones of good men and women, he accepted the scores of Imperial lives left to flicker out amidst the wreckage. The mission had to remain the priority. Into the storm. The Imperial convoy was over halfway to High Deathmire, rolling on through the immense and lonely darkness before dawn, when Yarrick's denuded air support reported a severe obstruction ahead. The column had suffered hit-and-run harassment from speed freaks for hours now. They had punched through hastily erected roadblocks and had come under repeated attack by Ork aircraft. However, what lay ahead was a threat of a different magnitude. According to Imperial cartographers, the long-abandoned fortifications of the Helicusa line crossed the highway 10 miles ahead. Layers of ash had largely buried the ancient defensive structures and the sprawling tank graveyard that stretched around their feet. The Orks had descended on these sedimentary layers of rusting metal, rapidly excavating them and transforming the resultant loot into ramshackle fortifications. Yarrick's spotters reported the scrap fort was still under construction. However, enough had been built to bar the road as it passed into a shallow cutting between shoulders of rock and half-excavated millennia-old structures. Tall scrap iron gates straddled the highway, flanked by floodlights and watchtowers bristling with Ork artillery. More structures proliferated below, cluttering a stretch of highway before another set of gates marked the fortress's southern entrance. Further towers and bunkers dotted the ridgeline, interspersed with stretches of wall for several miles to the east and west. The spotters reported a major warband massed within the fortress's walls. Thermo-augury suggested dozens of tanks, walkers, and lighter vehicles present. Hordes of Orkoid infantry infested the structures, and 3 super-heavy war effigies, known by the Orks as Stompers, squatted like colossal idols at the fort's heart. It was a formidable enough force to stall the Imperial advance entirely. Even worse news came in the form of a priority meteorological report. A ferocious storm of corrosive, irradiated ash was thundering from the south. Already, the remaining Navis Imperialis crews were requesting permission to climb steeply in an effort to avoid its fury. With his column bearing down on the Ork fortifications and the weather closing in, Yarrick held a rapid-fire Vox conference with his senior commanders. Should they attempt to flank west at speed, circumnavigating both the Orks and the worst of the storm? Should they halt and shelter from the storm as best they could, perhaps circling their heavier vehicles to shield the more vulnerable troop transports and supply tenders? Yarrick vetoed both suggestions. Time could not be wasted attempting to maneuver such a large convoy for miles in the dark across the hazardous terrain of the deep wastes, all while under attack. Instead, with the distance to the fort swiftly decreasing and the colossal storm front on the horizon, Yarrick and his officers agreed upon a risky strategy. The column was ordered to reform on the move, placing its heaviest elements to the fore, readying for a battering charge. They would fight through the fortifications, relying on the storm to disorient the enemy and provide cover for the Imperial convoy once it tore its way free and raced south towards Deathmire. Yarrick also hoped it might create a roadblock against Wazdaka's pursuit if they could leave suitable devastation behind them. Even as ordered flashed through the column and the Valkyries and Vultures veered off with a scream of turbines, Yarrick wondered why the bike boss had not already caught them up. He dared not hope Wazdaka had let his column escape. Where, then, was he? Yarrick was disquieted at not knowing the whereabouts of so dangerous a foe. Yet there was no more time to worry. Even as the Vox network popped and screeched with rising interference from the storm, the order to charge went out. The Orks had seen them coming. The ash storm was almost upon them, bathed in the crimson lumen glow within his command vehicle. Commissar Yarrick prayed to the God Emperor and gritted his teeth. Mayhem. Power plants roared as the Imperial tanks accelerated into a full charge. Though external vid feeds flushed green by necto filters, their crews could see Ork and Gretchen dashing to wall guns. Already, the wind was screaming over the structures, causing crude banners to snap wildly and corrugated metal sheets to groan against their rivets. The storm loomed like a tidal wave. The ash was disturbingly lambent, visible to the naked eye even in the night's darkness. Poisoned light glowed in its depths between sudden flashes of light. With the warhounds pounding at the fore, the Imperial host charged into the storm and opened fire. Explosive rounds lashed the Orks' walls and gates. Muzzle flare lit the night. Watchtowers burst like metal seed pods. The gate swung outward, flung open from within. Mobs of infantry, speeding bikers, and gunned-up buggies spilt through the gap. Behind them came heavier battle wagons. Shouting prayers and oaths, the Imperial crews surged to meet the foe. Titans, knights, and tanks laid down a storm of fire. The Imperial infantry, for their part, remained with their armoured transports. The Centaur RSVs had closed all firing hatches and secured flak weave coverings over their troop bays, doing what they could to ward off the storm's fury. Those Chimeras and Toroxes with advanced enough systems had pressurized their hulls against external contaminants. As the two forces slammed together in the shadow of the fortress walls, these proved wise precautions. The ash storm hit like a pyroclastic blast wave. Imperial crews saw Ork infantry plucked up by the storm winds and whirled away or flinched down to muscle and bone. The largest stumbled on, skin trailing from them in bloody streamers until they collapsed. Warbikes, buggies, and even the lighter Imperial tanks were hoisted and then dropped by the vicious winds. Many erupted in brief fireballs. Here and there flaming shapes span groundward. the lightning-blasted wrecks of Valkyries that hadn't climbed fast enough, smashing down amongst their comrades, turbines choked with ash. Visibility dropped even further as dense waves of toxic ash whirled over the battlefield. The Imperial Vox network and auspicator readouts broke into screaming static, while rad counters emitted insectile chirrs and hull integrity klaxons wailed. Dust devils taller than warlord titans tore through the storm, lightning leaping within them as they snatched up vehicles and tore apart buildings. Vid lenses cracked, leaving tank crews completely blind. Sparks erupted in the murk as speeding vehicles grazed one another, while others collided, belching more dirty fireballs into the uncaring maw of the storm. Imperial and Ork tank crews were forced to wait until they had their enemies at point-blank range before firing. They walked a tightrope between firing too soon and having their volleys blunted by the storm, or waiting too long and being annihilated before they could fight back. Formations lost cohesion. Each vehicle was forced to fight on alone as best it could. More than one Imperial tank slammed headlong into the ash-shrouded fortress walls, or else its crew became disoriented and set off the wrong way along the wall line, doomed to be buried in toxic ash or hunted down by Orks. The skilled nobles of House Hawkshroud and Terran angled the flickering half-domes of their ion shields to catch the worst of the storm and calibrated their gyroscopic compensators so their steeds leant into the wind. One fell as green energy snaked from a half-screen watchtower to punch through its carapace. Another was smashed out of the advancing battle line as a 30-foot-long girder impaled it like a hurled javelin. The Warhound Titans fared better, their weight and powerful servo motors helping them resist the storm. The Orks' lumbering war effigies coped best, for their low centers of gravity and tremendous weight made them hard for the wind to shift. However, even their massive super-heavy war engines suffered. The storm abraded exposed cables and wires while lightning crawled across their hulls. Void shields squealed beneath the barrage, and Orkoid power fields wobbled like bubbles about to burst. Through the gates. The Warhound Titans and Baneblade led the push through the gates and into the fort beyond. They met a wave of walkers, blasting the smaller war engines apart, while rockets and energy beams battered their defenses. Then came the Stompers, lumbering from the green-tinged gloom with all guns blazing. A trio of their enormous def cannon shells struck Lupex Destructor in quick succession. The Warhound's void shields collapsed, and high explosive armor penetration shells ploughed into its head before detonating. Princeps Ikodo and his Moderati were killed instantly. Engineer Lex Gamma 06 lived a second longer, before the firestorm billowing from the Warhound's bridge cooked her alive. Trailing smoke and flame, the decapitated Titan fell with the death knell bloom. Horns howling, Hound of Hades returned fire. The Baneblade added its fury to the fusillade, as did every other Leman Russ and Rogel Dawn in range. The belly plating of the lead Stompers gave way, allowing plasma fire to flood in. The war effigy reeled, shaking with internal explosions before detonating. Blazing from feet to armored head, one of its fellows waded into the Knights of House Terran and swung its titanic mega-chopper. The blow soared clean through the torso of a Knight Paladin before lodging deep in the body of the Knight Preceptor next to it. Burning, the Stomper rammed hard into a third Knight before crashing down on it. Though mournfully static, the surviving Terran nobles heard the last despairing scream of their cousin cut off with horrible finality. Amid the mayhem, Commissar Yarrick kept up a stream of orders and inspirational rhetoric. He never knew how much his subordinates could hear, so he urged everyone to keep fighting and moving, and not let themselves get bogged down. Firing wildly, hulls bubbling and scored by glowing ash, tanks and transports wove between flaming wrecks and crashed through shanty structures. Centaurs rolled on with flak screens tattered, the luckless Cadians within their troop bays trying desperately to lie flat as they sought to avoid the worst of the storm's mass. Finally reaching the southern gates, a squadron of Cadian demolishers blew them from their hinges. The Baneblade rolled over the wreckage, a disordered mass of tanks and transports close behind. The surviving knights and the scorched enormity of Hound of Hades followed. The Warhound Titan backed through the gates, void shields shuddering under weight of Ork fire, plasma blast gun flaring, and Vulcan megabolter screaming death. Ignoring the storm's fury, the last nobles turned their steeds about and joined the Titan. Stepping steadily backwards, firing furiously, they picked off tanks and buggies that burst through the veil of wind-blown ash. A handful more Imperial vehicles limped between the feet of the knights and Titan to escape southwards. Then came the looming form of the last Stomper, Morkanauts and Gorkanauts crowding around it. Knowing the numerous threats the column might yet face, Princeps Lengstrom and the last of the nobles pivoted swiftly and fled rather than stand and fight. They shrugged off a last hail of Ork fire as they outdistanced their pursuers. The Imperial column had broken through the Ork fortress, making all speed south again. Yet it was only when the storm finally passed over them, some 20 minutes later, and the last handful of gunships swept back in to provide paltry air cover, that the sheer cost of that effort became apparent. Less than half the original force remained. Not a vehicle amongst them was undamaged, and casualties amongst the infantry were severe. Worse, Ork attacks, coupled with the ferocity of the storm, had destroyed almost all the Adeptus Mechanicus support vehicles. There would inevitably be more tanks abandoned in their wake yet. Too damaged or low on fuel to continue, crews condemned to a slow and horrible death. Yet on the southern horizon, dark shadows could finally be seen against the pale light of dawn. The mass of the Hecate Mountains and, west of them, an appalling shroud of smoke rising from the firestorms consuming the equatorial jungle. Hive Deathmire lay ahead, but would it be standing when Yarrick reached it? Desperation. The closer Yarrick's column drew to Hive Deathmire, the more signs of desperate conflict confronted them. Vox channels swirled with panicked cries for help and static chopped orders from within the hive. Vehicle wrecks burned by the roadside, blackened corpses from both sides scattered around them. The highway passed clusters of buildings, hydro pump stations and garrison blockhouses. Most were burned out, or the scenes of battle between Astra Militarum soldiery and hordes of speed freaks. At Yarrick's order, the ravaged convoy barreled onwards, ignoring the calls for help that chased them down the highway. Ahead loomed the embattled hive, which had grown in the convoy's sights over the day from a blurred smudge on the horizon to a ravaged mountain of iron and stone as it drew nearer. Hive Deathmire was shrouded in filthy smoke and haloed by the leaping firelight of the conflagration to the south. Cinders danced between its spires. The contrails of warring aircraft cross-hatched the skies above. Even from a distance of many miles, it was evident that Deathmire was desperately beleaguered. The hive's armoured outer skin was blasted open in hundreds of places, or torn away and missing for thousands of yards at a time. The skeletal frames of ruined habstacks and industrial spires jutted up from within like mournful scarecrows. As Yarrick's column approached, it became possible to see scaffolding and gantries encasing many buildings like surgical exoskeletons, suggesting ongoing repairs being attempted even as the hive defenders fought to prevent it from falling. The flicker of muzzle flare and the tiny sparks of explosions were visible from the lowest foothills of its higher spires, yet titanic Aquila banners still fluttered from many of Deathmire's towers. The hive had not yet fallen. There was hope. Shedding vehicles whose fuel had run dry and others too damaged to keep rolling, Yarrick's convoy sped across the Phlegethon Bridge. They ploughed through a brawl between rampaging Goth beast-snoggers and a bloodied regiment of Deathmire's conscripts. At Commissar Yarrick's command, every Vox-Hailer in his force began broadcasting a loot message. He had returned. He lived. Just as the foe could not kill him, they would not defeat Armageddon. The God Emperor was with every last Imperial defender. They just had to keep fighting. It was hard to say what effect Yarrick's address had on the overrun conscripts or any of the half-dozen other battles the convoy passed. They could not stop long enough to involve themselves. Instead, they stormed on, Fortress of Arrogance rolling in the vanguard along with the last surviving hippogriffs, hellhounds, and armored personnel carriers. Hound of Hades remained close to the night-black Baneblade, while the convoy's surviving battle tanks and knights brought up the rear. The River Phlegethon was well behind them now. The grossly polluted Insane River lay ahead, and, directly beyond it, the armoured skirts of Hive Deathmire itself. Commissar Yarrick allowed himself a flicker of genuine hope, which fanned to a flame when a priority voxhail was patched through to him. Inquisitor Inigo Croyle, who had reached Hive Deathmire some days ago with the survivors of a Purgation Corps, had been appraised of Yarrick's mission. He waited at the far end of Tunnel Nulla Secunda with a force of requisition soldiery to help Yarrick reach his destination. Wazdaka's Race. Wazdaka leads his speedwar in the loop east to overtake the Imperial convoy. He cuts across the waste intended to join the Tempestora highway, then follow it to the feet of the Hecate Mountains. Tearing across the open waste is perilous. Many speed freaks crash or fall behind. Wazdaka doesn't care. He will win his race, and if his lads can't keep up, they don't make the cut. Gutsmech receives sporadic reports from his signal flyboys. These allow him to keep track of Yarrick's column. As the speedwar crosses the wastes, more hurtling warbands flock to Wazdaka's banner. Some he keeps with him, others are sent west to harass the Imperial convoy. After all, Gutsmech sees nothing wrong with stacking the odds in his favor. Wazdaka's tires hit the Tempestora highway just as dawn is breaking on Armageddon. He howls in triumph, knowing in his bones that he is winning his race. Thousands of speed freaks form a ragged caravan of destruction behind him. Wazdaka and his horde thunder down the Tempestora highways as the contrails of invasion craft burn through the skies overhead. Doom is coming to Hive Deathmire on blazing wheels. Reaching the rocky foothills of the Hecate Mountains, Wazdaka assaults the Rivet Head Barbican, one of the largest curtain walls protecting Hive Deathmire's northern approaches. Garrisoned Imperial troops are dismayed when Gutsmech and his shock-jump dragsters vanish into green light only to burst back into reality atop the 300-foot-wide rampart that runs along the wall top. As Wazdaka rampages through horrified Imperial gun crews, wagons roll into place on the craggy bluffs at the wall's eastern end and raise hydraulic ramps. Then, boosters blazing, swarms of warbikers and buggies attempt to leap from the ramps to the wall top. Those that survive join Wazdaka's speed mob, which fights its way west, using the wall top like an elevated highway. More Orks race along the foot of the wall, or soar ahead in deathcopters and Docker jets. The speed war bears down upon Nulla Secunda Tunnel, the route the Imperial convoy will surely have to take to pass under the Insane River to reach Deathmire safely. By the time the Humies reach their destination, Wazdaka will already be waiting on the finish line to greet them with all guns blazing. The final lunge. It was then that warnings raced through the convoy's command channels. Massive ash plumes had been sighted to the east, closing fast. An enormous force of speed freaks was racing to cut Yarrick's column off before it reached the river tunnel. Worse, one of the spotter Valkyries had confirmed that Wazdaka Gutsmech led the horde. The cold fire that seemed now to be always within Yarrick's heart spread through him until it pricked his fingers and toes. He would not be stopped now, no matter the cost. Filled with a mingled sense of exhaustion and determination, Yarrick issued his orders. His vanguard accelerated, piling on speed as they shot towards the cavernous maw of the tunnel. The rest of Yarrick's force peeled off to intercept the speed freaks, visible as a chaotic mass tearing along the foot of the wall. Grossly outnumbered, battle-damaged and low on fuel and ammunition, there was no hope of Imperial victory. Yet, if the tank crews and nobles could sell themselves dearly enough, they might hold back Wazdaka's hordes long enough for Yarrick to make it through the tunnel. With artillery shells and rockets raining around them, Yarrick's vanguard made their final dash. They were less than a mile away when the cry went up. Wazdaka wasn't out on the plains leading the main horde. Instead, He was roaring down the steeply sloped outer face of the Barbican wall with a crazed mass of speed freaks on his tail. Green energies flared. Wazdaka and many of the speedsters with him blinked into being on the highway ahead of Yarrick's convoy. More speed freaks rained down behind, some tumbling and smashing as they lost control, others whooping with exhilaration as they rode out the wild descent and skidded onto the roadway. The speed freaks raced out from the tunnel mouth, guns thundering. Wazdaka Gutsmech led them with a howl of triumph, for he had won his race against the gits who had tried to sneak past him. Even better, most of them were now burning in the wrecks of their puny Hume tanks. A good fight at the race's end was a delightful bonus. The Imperial force, for their part, didn't slow. Guns spitting the last dwindling dregs of their ammunition, they charged headlong at the Orks. The two met with a dreadful rending of metal, screeching of tires, and the dull thuds of bodies striking hard objects at extreme speed. War bikes flipped into the air or vanished beneath wheels and tracks. Armored cars and flame tanks exploded, rolling to a halt in the mouth of the tunnel they had fought so hard to reach. Fortress of Arrogance took multiple hits across its massive glacis plate before the towering form of Hound of Hades strode in to soak up the Orcs' fire. Even Wazdaka hadn't reckoned with an Imperial Titan. However, now he was confronted by it. He knew he had to bring it down. Everything else vanished from him. Void shields long collapsed, armor chewed and battered by what looked like days of hard fighting. The machine was surely ripe to fall. The Warhound's megabolter span up with a world-ending scream. Wazdaka wove through the streams of explosive bolts that tore up the highway and pulverized the warbikers trying to follow him. Moving like a green and red thunderbolt, he streaked past the Titan's right foot with his grabber-dragger outstretched. The impact of his massive claw with the mechanism of the Titan's ankle almost tore Wazdaka from his saddle. Big Rever fishtailed wildly before he could get the enormous warbike back under control. Hitting the brakes and dropping a foot, the bike boss slewed around, gunned his engines, and came back for another pass. The Titan lifted its leg to take another step, but to Wazdaka's satisfaction, the hydraulics and servo motors in its ankle spewed sparks and lubricant where his talons had torn through them. The foot half rose off the ground, hanging awkwardly. The war machine swayed, and then tried to slam its foot back down. As it did, Wazdaka poured fire into the damaged joint, Big Rever's psycho-gattlers striking more sparks and causing something to detonate within the joint's workings. He saw the swayed Titan try to turn and bring its murderous guns to bear upon him, but Wazdaka was too fast. A second time, he thundered past his prey. A second time, his grabber-dragger connected with its ankle, and once more, the impact was enough to send Wazdaka skidding out of control. Big Rever somehow stayed up, slamming sideways into an ash drift beside the road and throwing up a dense cloud. As the haze cleared, Wazdaka staggered to his feet, hauling Fix-It out of the drift by one scrawny leg. The biker boss had eyes only for the Titan. Ankle destroyed, foot all but severed, it listed past its center of balance. Its last vengeful salvos soared the air well above Wazdaka's head as the machine toppled backwards with a howl of overstretched metal and smashed down hard enough to shake the ground. Dust and filth billowed skywards, armor buckled under the impact. Internal systems exploded. Shrapnel filled the air as detonations racked the downed Warhound. Wazdaka grinned as scorched metal raged down around him. Sure, it was smaller than the monster he had felled on Skalax 6, but that was 2 Hume Titans he destroyed now. Show him the speed boss who would equal that feat. Belatedly, Wazdaka looked around to see a few of the tanks that made it past him vanish into the tunnel. He considered giving chase, then shrugged. What did he care about a handful of half-dead Humies who had already lost the race? Their city was overrun. Skullcrumper's lads would see to those last survivors soon enough. No, thought Wazdaka, clambering aboard Big Rever and kicking its engines back to life. Give him the open plains. There were plenty more races to be won and Humies to be clobbered, starting with the last handful of those who had stayed outside to slow his speed while down. Ash Fountain, as Wazdecker revved his speed bike and sped east to join the fight against the last of Yarrick's rearguard, howling speed freaks roaring in his wake. The Last Gambit. Killwrecker hung over Armageddon. Aboard, Ghazghkull Thraka stomped across its cavernous command bridge. His passage caused trophy racks to rattle, and the naval armsmen impaled on them groaned with wet raspy breaths. Around him, mech boys laboured at repairs or worked Killwrecker's weapons. Goth bosses bellowed at Blood Axe Finker boys, who strove to keep track of the action planetside. It was a command and control network that, though it frequently devolved into physical violence, was visionary by Ork standards. Ghazghkull was well aware that without his presence, it would collapse. That was why he had to stay in orbit, at least a little longer, even though he longed to join the fighting. Instead, he listened to shouted orders and reports ringing through the command bridge. He bellowed and bludgeoned whenever he knew the personal touch was needed. Then he heard something that snagged his attention in a death grip.
"Say that again,"
he growled, looming over a pair of blood axes squabbling over a shouting tube.
"A Humie convoy broke out of High Volcanus, boss. Wazdecker's gone after 'em. They had a big black super wagon leading 'em, and the lads reckon there was some Humie big shot on board."
A frisson of something more than instinct tingled through Ghazghkull's immense frame. It couldn't be, could it? Had the gods really been so generous?
"Some git! Get me a looking scope on that convoy!"
he rumbled. Soon, Ghazghkull was squinting at a grady image beamed from the surface. Sure enough, there it was, roaring along amid a battered mass of Humie wagons, black as a goth's best shoulder pads, and with all manner of glitz and flash bolted onto it.
"So, old Baelai made it back," he said. "Me best enemy, back for more. But what are yous up to, ya cunning git?"
Ghazghkull pondered the atrocity he'd had Snickrot perpetrate against High Volcanus' astropaths.
"That it, ya sneak? Biggest boss goes to what? Get a message out from Deathmire? You sending for the Marine gits?"
Ghazghkull was conflicted. Would the fight on Armageddon be more fun with Space Marines? Absolutely. But the last time they showed up, they ruined things. He considered dropping down there and crumping the old git all over again. Maybe it would stick this time, though Ghazghkull rather hoped not. Besides, he knew he couldn't. Not yet. That if Yarrick could come back from Ghazghkull stomping him flat, then in theory he could come back from anything. And meanwhile, he couldn't be allowed to call for help yet.
"Give me fire control of that custom super blaster," he grunted. "Soon as the git's fancy wagon comes out the other end of that tunnel, I'll frag it myself."
Inquisitor Croyle had amassed a force of 2,000 Hive militia and some 50 Tempesta Scions of the 18th Scion Jackals. These he had led to a down-hive refinery complex bordering the southern exit of Tunnel Nullus Secunda. A horde of Goths and beast-snaggers had given chase. Now, Croyle had his army dig into the refinery complex and hammered fire into the onrushing Xenos. Croyle tracked a beast boss as it pounded closer between rusted pipes and machine shrines. He settled his Jindarii Toxcycler's sights on the monster and squeezed his trigger.
"Ha! Another bullseye!"
he barked. The enormous orc collapsed, fresh bubbling, bloody froth spilling from its mouth and eyes. Croyle was picking another target when a Scion Jackal appeared beside his six-limbed Garrulesque steed. "Movement in the tunnel, Inquisitor," said the Scion. "Convoy 30 seconds out." Croyle turned his Garrulesque. Behind him was a ferrocrete barrier where the tunnel entrance yawned like a cave. The roar of engines reached him first. Then came limping Imperial vehicles, led by the black bulk of the Baneblade. Then the clouds above lit green. The Inquisitor had time to look up in horror before a spear of iridescent fire reached down and struck the Baneblade. The shock wave knocked some of Croyle's soldiers from their feet. The green fire died. The Baneblade, pierced through, burned. Croyle felt despair. Yarrick, slain. Worse, the precious burden he bore was surely annihilated. Yet maybe the Farus Horrifica could be salvaged? Croyle's Garrelisk had only taken a few paces when a handful of chimeras emerged from the tunnel, flanked by a pair of Hippogriff AFVs. The transports halted in the cover of the overhanging refinery structures. Only then did the top hatch of the nearest chimera swing open, and an unmistakable figure rose from within. This time the cries from the militia were of wonder and joy. "Well met, Inquisitor," said Commissar Yarrick. Croyle heard the soul-deep weariness in every syllable. Yet there was a glimmer of triumph there too. The ghost of a smile haunted Yarrick's lips. "A decoy," said Croyle, impressed. "One that has worked for now," replied the Commissar. "I have reached Deathmire, though hundreds have died to see me this far. With your aid, their sacrifice will not be in vain." The Last Gasp. Distance from Command Spire, 4.4 miles. Commissar Yarrick and Inquisitor Croyle lead their scratch force in a determined counterattack against the Goth Orks, seeking to overrun their position. The presence of the iconic hero of Hades' Hive goads the Deathmire militia companies to fanatical efforts while simultaneously filling their enemies with superstitious dread. Despite heavy casualties, the Imperial forces put their enemies to flight. Distance from Command Spire, 3.7 miles. Driving along as direct a route as possible, Yarrick and Croyle lead their soldiers through the Forge-Heart district toward the Hive's central spires. However, they face a dense and many-leveled hivescape that is badly damaged and filled with ferocious conflict. The Orks of War Skullcrumper have overrun the Smelters and Haulers districts on the Hive's southern side, and the Peakside Sprawl on its eastern edge. Now they are pushing through the Petitioners' wards to the west and the Armourers' district to the east, flowing around the bulwark of Hiveheart and the central spires, and threatening to encircle them wholesale. Yarrick's precious message must make it through before that happens. Distance from Command Spire, 3.9 miles. Seeking to climb the Lamplighter's Stair in Forgeheart's district, Yarrick's force risks being embroiled in a ferocious ongoing battle around the Stairhead block fortress. Retreating rather than being destroyed, they follow Transitway Delta 11 west into the fringe of the cloisters. They hit another dead end several miles along this route, where Cadian platoons are dug in and resisting a tide of Orks pouring from the nearby refabrication stacks. Diverting again, Yarrick and Croyle lead their fatigued force through the Hab Shanties that clot the border between Forgeheart and the cloisters, hoping to slip unnoticed between warring armies and keep moving inwards. Distance from Command Spire, 2.7 miles. Running into a scattered band of Death Skulls, Yarrick's force attempts to fight across the industrial canyon of Smog Gorge. Upon discovering its third and fifth bridges have been destroyed, they are temporarily trapped. It costs Yarrick's protectors dearly to break out of the tightening noose as more Orks are drawn to the sounds of fighting. With the militia ranks devastated, a meager trio of armoured vehicles remaining from Yarrick's armoured column, and 2 squads of Scions surviving, the force can finally escape across the 8th bridge and into the fringes of a sprawling shrine-plex. Distance from Command Spire, 1.3 miles. Commissar Yarrick dares to hope. The Calgar Tower rising on the far side of the shrine-plex should provide a direct route up to the central spires from below. Yet, as his force picks a route between the battle-damaged shrines, they are set upon by mobs of Red Skull commandos. The fight is desperate, and both Yarrick and Inquisitor Croyle are injured. Worse, they are forced to sacrifice the last of their Tempestor Scions and armoured vehicles, fighting a doomed rearguard action to hold the commandos at bay. leading a mere 70 exhausted but determined militia soldiers, Yarrick and Croyle begin to climb the helical ramp that winds up Calgar Tower to the spires above. Distance from Command Spire, 0.4 miles. The ragged remains of Yarrick's force are only 2 levels below their destination when a burning Ork lander plunges between the high scaffold-encrusted towers and slams into the way platform above. Bellowing Goth Orks spill from the burning wreck and pour down the ramp to attack. With tailored rounds from his Tox Cycler, Inquisitor Croyle puts down first the Warband's monstrous Weird Boy and then, with a neat shot through his vision slit, the sore-fisted Death Dread that lumbers in the Orcs' midst. Yarrick's clipped orders see the militia form firing lines and mow down dozens of charging Orcs. Still, it becomes clear the Xenos charge is going to crash home. Distance from Command Spire, 0.4 miles. Filled with cold fury at all the lies the Orcs have cost, determined not to let the foe stop him so close to his destination, Commissar Yarrick utters a furious war cry and leads his soldiers in a counter-charge that takes the Orcs by surprise. In the crunching melee that follows, Orcs and humans alike are hacked apart or sent tumbling off the ramp's sheer sides to plummet screaming into the depths below. Yarrick uses his power claw to tear the head from the brutish Goth war boss leading the horde. Croyle picks off one big boss and knob after another. Finally, shocked at the zeal of the militia and with their leaders all slain, the last Goths are driven back to the burning wreck of their lander and butchered. Distance from Command Spire, 0.0 miles. Commissar Yarrick limps into Hive Deathmire's core command spire, escorted by a single squad of 15 surviving militia soldiers and the pale but determined Croyle. Every one of their names will be recorded in the annals of Armageddon's many heroes, but there is no time for such ceremony now. The high central strategium is a scene of barely controlled panic, where crimson glyphs flash on hollow cartographs and choral warnings boom from loud hailers. With infinite weariness, Commissar Yarrick sees that his work is far from done. He will need to be both the indomitable leader and feared commissar for those panicked strategos and officers if order is to be restored. But before all that, he has a mission to complete. The commissar goes alone to the astropathic sanctum atop the command spire. There he delivers the Farus Horrifica to the astropathic choir, who receive their burden with somber acceptance. Aware of the price they will pay, they nonetheless do their duty. The overwhelming power and psychic weight of the sending immolates each screaming astropath in turn before booming out into the warp like the shattering peal of some cyclopean bell. Every astropath and weird boy in the Armageddon system cries out in shock. Many weep tears of blood and ghostly flame. A world's distress call thunders into the void. Commissar Yarrick's mission might be over, but the war for Armageddon is not. However, if matters do not change, it will be soon, for the world's situation has never been more dire. Orkoid landing craft rain down across Armageddon in uncountable numbers. High Volcana stands besieged, with more Orks pouring through the Mannheim Gap and across the plains of Anthrand by the hour to batter at its walls. Hive Deathmire holds, but barely. Only 4 of its 9 primary districts remain, for now, in Imperial hands. The equatorial jungle burns in 100 places as the ragged remains of the Purgation Corps fight for their lives. As to Armageddon Secundus's hives, the Imperial facilities in the Deadlands and the Fire Wastes, what broken Vox missiles make it through the filth-choked atmosphere send ominous and desperate. Gazgul stands poised to make planetfall in person. More Orks arrive in the Armageddon system by the hour, and still more teleport into being throughout the neighboring systems. World after world screams out for salvation. It is perhaps no surprise when Subsector Command, desperately seeking to cogitate a response to such sudden and overwhelming violence, is forced to issue the strategic proclamation they hoped never to send. Armageddon has fallen. Present day. Armageddon has fallen. In the command stratagem of Hive Deathmire, the savior of Armageddon turned the words over in his mind until they became a mental drumbeat. They were underscored by the thumping reverberation of distant explosions, the buzz and squawk of cogitator engines and vox relays, the monotonous burr of servitor annunciations, and the shouts of command from dozens of officers. Commissar Yarrick's face remained a grim mask of calm, despite the horrors unfolding around him. Deathmire's fate had surely been sealed, with alien hordes closing in and its southernmost districts overrun. Hive Infernus was now completely besieged. Hades and Thoradis were long destroyed. Tempestoria lay in the clutches of the enemy. Hell's Reach seawall had been breached, the toxic floodwaters pouring in to drown the lower city. Acheron and Vulcanus held firm, but even the most optimistic strategos projected they would fall within weeks. How many days of slaughter had passed since Yarrick had given the Pharos Horrifica to Deathmire's astropaths? Dozens, perhaps scores. Let the message have escaped, God Emperor. Please let them answer. Yarrick believed he had concealed his despair well. Even within his sanctum, he allowed his doubts to flare only in the privacy of his skull. At such times, the grisly business required by his new life-sustaining regimen was agonizing, and he did not fully understand what was being done to him. However, the pain and ignorance served to sharpen his will. He emerged from these ministrations with vigor and strength to embolden those around him, to inspire last stands to take command decisions, enough fire to power the furnace of his soul until his next treatment. A brigadier approached, gripping a data slate. Yarrick saw the officer's hands tremble as they held it out. With a glance, Yarrick consumed its contents. Acheron had fallen. A massive asteroid had plunged towards the Hive in a seeming repeat of the murder of Hades so long ago. Acheron's defenders had unleashed everything they had, confident in shattering the oncoming mass, but it had been a ruse. The asteroid had fractured under fire, disgorging separate rocks and invasion landers laden with Orks. Worse came. Teleportation flares had been detected in the upper reaches of the Hive's command spire. A final panicked communique had identified the perpetrator, Ghazghul himself. The beast had learned and had honed his strategy, just as Yarrick had warned. Yarrick dismissed the brigadier, suddenly uncertain of his self-control. He had hoped his presence at Hive Deathmire would tempt the Grand Warlord to attack him in person. He had even sent out Vox message taunts to Ghazghul to goad the beast into a reckless response. But Ghazghul had not taken the bait. Not this time. The need to slump in defeat was almost overwhelming. Yarrick turned, and light swam in his vision. Fear gripped him that the ailment afflicting him would suddenly become acute. But the blazing lights were not in his mind. They sparked into life on every hololith. Yarrick recognized the signature contrails of orbital landers, the scar-like traceries of drop pod descents. Have they come? Is it them? A sense of awed wonder flooded Yarrick. He stamped it down, fearful his heart would break if what emerged from the landers was not the planet's redemption, but its death knell. Officers' shouts caught in their throats. A buzz of feedback scratched over the Vox network. A static lace voice emerged from a Vox emitter, its timbre possessing the distinctive power and authority of one of the Emperor's angels. Amid the sound, a single word was heard. Imperator.